welcome to this week's Exploring the Gospel of John. This week we're going to continue with the story of the resurrection, the story of what happened after Jesus rose from the dead. And it's particularly this time now his appearance to Mary, and then his appearance to the disciples in the upper room. And I think it's an important passage, because I think if you look at it closely in terms of this chapter, at the end of this chapter, could have been the end of John's gospel, and yet it continues on into chapter 21. And so I think that it's an important chapter. It's almost, in a sense, I suppose, in a sense, locking up the whole concept of the gospel and what that gospel was about and what it was trying to achieve. And in some ways, the chapter 21 is an addendum, is kind of the next step. We've now wrapped up the relationship with Jesus, but now the next step is about the church and about how we actually do that and what we're supposed to do within it. A little bit like the end of Matthew's gospel in the Great Commission. But we'll get to that one next week. This week, we're going to be looking, obviously, then at John chapter 20 and then verses 11 to 31. So let's listen to it again. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." She told them that he had said these things to her. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, these disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet believed." This is a remarkable passage, and just the story of the different characters within it and the connections that they have and the ways in which the interaction happens, I think is food for lots of meditation and thought. And so I'd like you to spend a bit of time thinking about it and seeing, what does the passage mean for you? What are the things that stand out? What are the things that touch your heart? And discuss that together. Welcome back. I want to begin with some of the symbols within this particular story. And two of the symbols particularly are connected to the two characters. And so the first character, of course, is the character of Mary Magdalene. And it's interesting how John's gospel, John focuses on Mary. In the other gospels, we have some of the other women that are involved or connected there. But in this one, it's focused particularly on Mary and on Mary Magdalene. And in a sense, in this particular chapter, one of the wonderful things about it is the interaction that happens. She comes to the tomb, she sees that Jesus is gone, and her first thought is, someone's stolen him. And you can imagine that would have been a very real issue for the disciples, that someone may have stolen the body so that they wouldn't be able to claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so she says, just tell me where. And then, of course, we have that wonderful interaction where she turns around, and who knows why. Possibly she's crying, and so she's not looking properly, but she doesn't recognize Jesus, and she thinks he's just the gardener. And she says, where have you put him? Where have they taken him? And then just with one word, comes the recognition for Mary, where he says, Mary. What I want to connect with that for myself is the fact that he calls her by name. Notice that, in fact, the two times that it's been woman, both the angels and when she thinks he's the gardener, she's addressed as woman. Why are you crying? But when it comes to that point of connection, of intimacy, of relationship, of reconnection, Jesus looks at her and says, Mary. He calls her by name. And I think there's something so amazing about that, where Jesus comes to her and she recognizes him when he calls her by name. And I think for me, what that does is it tells me about the fact that God calls each of us, not just by our gender pronoun or by some generic perspective or some group name. He calls us by name. He knows our name. And I think that for me is something that this passage connects with in terms of Mary, is that when Jesus calls us to serve him, when Jesus calls us to come into relationship with him, he's looking for not a bunch of followers. He's not looking for a mob who's going to go and beat up other people. He's not going to go and take over the Romans. He's actually going to call each of us by name and give us that task. Mary. And the interesting thing with this one is that, of course, she then becomes the first proclaimer, the first preacher of the gospel. He is risen. Jesus is alive. I mean, essentially every sermon, every time we come to a congregation and proclaim before them, that's the message. The message is Jesus is alive. And the first one in terms of John's gospel who goes and preaches that message is the one who's been called by name to do it. Mary. I think it's wonderfully, though, juxtaposed with the second image, and that's of Thomas. And Thomas gets such a bad rap. He gets such a bad rap because we keep on calling him, we say, a doubting Thomas, and that's become part of our colloquial English expressions. Oh, he's just a doubting Thomas. But in fact, I think that Thomas plays an essential role here, because it's an essential role not only about the actual resurrection, but really about us. I think that Thomas is much more a connection with those who will come afterwards than actually about the disciples. Because you'll notice that, in fact, what Jesus does, actually just at the previous time, is that Jesus, before he meets with Thomas, he actually comes into the upper room with the other disciples and shows them his hands and his side. So when Thomas says, unless I see that, I'm not going to believe, they can't get upset with him, because in fact, they were shown that by Jesus when he came. Instead, I think the most important passage of this, or the most important connection with what Thomas represents, is what Jesus says, blessed are those who will believe without seeing. And when you think about that, that's really all of us. All of us are believing without seeing. And Jesus says, blessed are those who will believe without seeing. He's actually saying that, in fact, that's what really is about faith. That faith is not about actually been taking your finger and putting it into the holes in his hands and taking your hand and putting it in his side. It's actually saying, I don't need to do that. And notice that Thomas never actually does it. He doesn't do it. When Jesus gives him the offer, though, he responds with, yes, my Lord and my God. You see, I think that, in fact, real faith is not about saying that we need to put our fingers in the holes in his hands or our hand in his side. That faith comes from knowing the relationship with God. And that follows on from Mary Magdalene. As God calls us, as Christ calls us by name, that's why we know that Jesus is alive. We don't believe that Jesus is alive because John tells us, because the Bible tells us. We believe that Jesus is alive because we've been called by name to follow him. The third image, or the third symbol that I want to deal with, is when in fact Mary acknowledges and notices who Jesus is, her response is in Aramaic. And she says Rabboni, which of course is the Aramaic for rabbi, which is the Hebrew. And both of them, of course, meaning teacher. And I found that such a fascinating thing that she would say, that she wouldn't say my Lord, or even call him by name in terms of Jesus, or call him by in terms of what he would do, or my King, or whatever. It's interesting that the one that Mary responds with is Rabboni. And the interesting thing for me as well with John is that he tells it that she said it in Aramaic, the colloquial language, the language of the people, the ordinary language, not the Hebrew. She wasn't making a statement about Jesus's a kind of spiritual connection. In fact, it was a very personal, very connected response for an ordinary person that would say to Jesus, Rabboni, my teacher. And I think it's often the thing that we lose from Jesus, is that Jesus is meant to be the one that we follow because he will teach us, he will mentor us, he will move us. In this day and age, it's become a major thing to have a coach. And essentially we can use that image of the coach, of the Rabboni, which actually would be the one that would help us and care for us and enable us to go and do what God has called us to do, and to be what God has called us to be. I'd like us to think about those three images of being called by name, of being allowed to doubt, but therefore connecting in faith, and then acknowledging that Jesus is the one who would teach us, the one who can be for us our teacher in our lives together. I'd like us to reflect on what that means for you as you share that together. Welcome back. As we go a little deeper into this passage, I want to highlight two things that I think are important for us. The first one is the word expectation. You know, one of the things that I think makes the account of Jesus' resurrection so much more plausible is the fact that the writers of the Gospels tell us that the disciples were not expecting him to rise from the dead. You know, I think that in fact one of the things would have been that if the whole passage was written with all victory and yes, he's died, but don't worry, he's going to rise again, and they were all waiting, having a campfire outside the door or outside the tomb, just waiting for him to rise again, I actually would have been much more skeptical of it. But the truth is that Mary, Thomas, the disciples, none of them actually thought that it was going to happen. They were in the upper room, locked away. They had locked the doors in fear of the authorities. The last thing that they thought that was going to happen was that Jesus was going to come into their midst and say, peace be with you. But that lack of expectation is the very thing that, for me, makes the story plausible. They were unexpected. The fact that he did rise from the dead was something that they didn't know, they didn't believe was going to happen. They didn't understand it. In fact, they didn't understand it, as the Bible tells us, in fact, until after the fact. And I think sometimes it's that same expectation sometimes that we've got as well, is that we look at the church, we look at ourselves, and we kind of go, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what God can do in this. It seems impossible. It seems too sad. It seems too broken. It seems that, in fact, there's no coming back from where we are now. And then we see this story. And what we're filled with in this story is that sense of, actually, in God, the unexpected is possible. And in fact, sometimes maybe not even possible, but probable. That God's going to act in a way that we don't expect. That God's going to do what we don't even imagine being possible. It's in that level of expectation that we need to operate and connect with. The second concept here is where Mary, obviously, when she sees that it's Jesus, she obviously goes to hug him, to enfold him. And he says, no, don't do that, because I haven't yet ascended. And for me, as I kept on reading this and reading different commentaries and other scholars' perspectives on this, it seems as if we don't really have a real hold on what does that mean? Why do you say, I've not yet ascended to the Father? And almost in a sense, I think that what this is about wanting to hold on to that earthly Jesus. You see, I think that too often what we've done in the church is we're a little, what can one say, a little bit worried about the resurrected Jesus. This guy who can appear in rooms at will. This guy who seems to be able to travel distances and go to different connections, and sometimes, in fact, isn't even recognized by his own disciples. We get a bit worried about that. And sometimes what we're wanting to do is we want to go back to the physicality of Jesus. We want to make him normal again. We want to bring him back to his only his humanity, and not the resurrected person that he is. And so I think when he says, don't hold on to me, what he's really saying is, don't hold on to that limited physical reality that I am. But I'm going to ascend to the Father. And once I'm there, that's when you can really acknowledge who I am. Because you see, as much as Jesus is human, he's not just. Because let's understand, in the laws of physics, you can't just appear and disappear at will. But in terms of the resurrection, where Jesus now is more than just human, he's more than just what he was. He's a resurrected being. And that's what, of course, Paul tells us, is that we look forward to one day when we too will shed this physical, finite, limited body for a resurrected one. Exactly what that looks like, exactly how that works, well, we'll have to wait and see. But I think that for me, when I look at that concept of him telling her not to hold on to him, I think what it really is, it's a word to all of us as the church, is to be careful about reducing Jesus again into that finite, limiting body. And I think that includes our whole arguments about gender and about pronouns and about his sexuality and about all of those things which so often we get caught up in scholarly debate. Instead, seeing Jesus ascended, sitting on the right hand of the Father, the one who has the power and the limitless power and authority to bring about change in our society. So let's think about that. Let's reflect on that for a bit, asking ourselves, what do we connect with in terms of expectation? Are we also a little despairing? Are we also a little sad, disappointed in terms of our world, in terms of our church, maybe in terms of even our own Christianity? What's the expectations that we can have where Jesus can go beyond what we expect? And then, of course, what does it mean for us that Jesus is ascended, that he is on the right hand of the Father, that he's no longer limited by our limitations in humanity, but in fact, he's been set free from that? Let's discuss that. Welcome back. I want to finish this week's session by looking at the application. And for me, the application comes from that single word. In fact, it would be a single word in Hebrew and Aramaic, which Jesus comes as he meets with his disciples. That when he comes into the upper room, his first thing is, peace be with you. And of course, in the Hebrew, that would be shalom. Shalom. And he says shalom to them. And he does it 3 times in the course of that upper room discourse. And each time, shalom, peace be with you. And I think it would be really necessary. I mean, all of a sudden they're worried about the authorities. The doors are locked, and Jesus then just appears in the middle of them. I can imagine that would be a lot of gasps, that there would be a lot of unease, there would be a lot of fear in the room. And so there's no doubt that Jesus would say, shalom, peace be with you. But notice that the peace be with you is only a prerequisite for what he tells them to do next. And that is, peace be with you, I'm sending you out. I'm sending you out. I think that this is absolutely pivotal to the whole story of John's Gospel. Is that John's Gospel was never just about us. It was never about our faith. It was never just about that we believe, but it was also about that we go out and do. And we're going to see that particularly when we look at chapter 21 next week. But for me, it's so important that Jesus says, peace be with you first. I think that, in fact, being sent out is a uniquely fear-inducing reality. I think for so many of us, we find it so hard when we get told to go out, when we get told to go and tell about Jesus, when we get told to share our faith with somebody else. I think for most of us, we go, look, send someone else. And yet, the ultimate sign of discipleship is not belief in Jesus, but in living out that belief by being sent out. But notice as well is that he doesn't send them out alone. In John's Gospel, as opposed to Luke's version in the book of Acts, we see the coming of the Holy Spirit. And it's a wonderfully earthy way that John does it, because it says he breathed on them. Not very COVID safe, but he breathed the Holy Spirit onto them. And so there's that sense of his very breath. He gives them then to breathe in, so that breath becomes theirs. The very act of breathing actually breathes the Holy Spirit into their lives, into their being. It keeps them literally and figuratively alive. I think that we are being sent out. But we're being sent out not by ourselves. First of all, we've been sent out with the word shalom. We've been sent out with the word, have peace in this and know that God will be with you. But then also, we sent out with the companion, with the Holy Spirit, who can enable us, who can connect with us, who can help us, who can share with us, who can teach us, who can direct us, who can convict us, as Paul will tell us in the book of Timothy. We've got help. We just need to ask for it. We just need to breathe it in. As we close this week, I pray that you would reflect on that concept. So to reflect on the idea that God gives us peace. What does that peace look like or feel like for you? That God gives us a mission to be sent out. And that also God gives us a companion. God gives us a help to enable us as we get sent out. The Holy Spirit, when he breathes upon us. Let's discuss that together.